Good morning, everyone. As you can see, we're keeping secrets. Unfortunately, our center projector decided this morning to take a vacation. I guess this projector doesn't like Angola or something, but anyway, we'll try to make do with the two-side projectors, and hopefully you can all at least see a little bit of it. Today we're going to talk about the natural and cultural history of the country of Angola. We also are going to talk a little bit about some of the I guess you'd say issues that face the country today. But basically, we'll start with going back a little bit in history. The name Angola comes from the Portuguese colonial name, which was Reino de Angola, or the Kingdom of Angola. The title actually comes even earlier than that because there was a king, they were called the Ndongo kings, and they lived up in the highlands, and their country was called Angola, pronounced the same way but with no A on the front end of it. Beautiful country of Angola is nearly twice the size of the state of Texas and about 5 times the land area of Great Britain. The Zambezi River and several tributaries of the Congo River have their sources in Angola itself. The Zambezi is the 4th longest river in Africa. The mouth and a western end of the Congo River form a really small portion of Angola's border with the Democratic Republic of Congo. The river basin is a very large source, a huge source of diamonds for the country. They were discovered in the main river channel as well as up on the flats and terraces and the mud flats of its floodplains. The most prominent place to experience Angola's geology is a place called Mirador da Lua. That translates to the Valley of the Moon landscape or viewpoint. The valley's jagged cliffs and sharp pinnacles have really deep gullies that were shaped by centuries, perhaps even millenniums of erosion. It's located about 35 miles southwest of Luanda. It's pretty close to the coast. That's also where there are some very shallow underground sediments that are producing about 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. Diamonds and oil. You can almost taste the money in Luanda. More on that later, but for now, let's look at the people of Angola. The first people in Angola were the Khoisan. They were hunter-gatherers. They have been commonly in the past called Bushmen, but the name Khoisan is preferred. In fact, they consider Bushman to be a little bit prerogative. Recent estimates reveal that there are about maybe 100,000 of them that still exist in Africa today. The Khoisan languages are known for their use of clicking noises. They put clicks in their speech, and it makes it sound, they use the clicks instead of consonants. Examples of sound are familiar to English speakers who use things like tisk tisk or tut tut to express disapproval or pity. And then they also use like you use to make a horse go faster. At least that's the way I make my horse go faster. From about 4,000 years ago, Africa itself as a continent became a scene of great human migrations. All across the continent, people were moving. About 500 BC, so about 2,500 years ago, the Batu had weaponry that was Iron Age weaponry, and that empowered them to be able to displace the Stone Age Khoisan. Today, there are over 90 different ethnic groups in Angola, and they all speak a variety of Bantu languages. We'll take a look at some of them. The Bantu still make up about 3/4 of Africa's population. They have many beliefs, many different faiths and religions, if you will. The children are always taught to show respect by not looking their elders in the eye. And among the Bantu people are the Mabunda and the Chakwe. When you see a child, a lot of times when you want them to look up at you and smile, a lot of times they won't. They're very fearful of doing that because their parents have indoctrinated them. The masks and statues of the Chakwe people are regarded as some of the finest wood carvings in Central Africa. The Chakwe masks symbolize various ancestral beliefs, and they were and still are used during rites of passage, circumcision, fertility, and puberty. Mabundu is the second largest ethnic group in Angola, and at the end of the last century, they numbered about 2.5 million people. They occupy much of north-central Angola between the Dande and the Kawanza rivers. They're very distinct from the more populous Ovumbundo, and we'll visit them in a few minutes. Queen Ninja, kind of sounds like she should be in Japan wearing a black suit and carrying a sword, was a 17th century Angolan queen of the Mbundu people. She's really viewed as a heroine all across Africa. And one of the major streets in Luanda was named after her, and also this statue of her sits right outside of the Fort São Miguel. Many Angolans really today, they worship her so much that they're married right near this statue, and especially that'll happen on days like Thursday and Friday. Why they pick Thursday and Friday to get married, I don't know, but that's their day. Anyway, Njinga first appeared in Luandan history when she was trying to get the Portuguese to just, hey, move out of here, leave Angola alone. The Portuguese governor, he just wanted to kind of treat her like everybody else, so he put a mat on the floor, and he wanted her to sit on the mat. Well, the Mbundo custom was that if sitting directly on the floor was really good only for subordinates. So the queen had a slave come in, or one of her servants come in and kneel down on the floor, and then she sat on top of the servant, so she was at the same level as the governor. And that showed her authority, it showed her equal status to the governor, and it proved her worth as a brave and confident leader. The Congo people is another Bantu group. They live along the Atlantic coast of Angola. They stretched originally from the Republic of Congo down into Angola, and then in the late 20th century, the Congo people's population was about 10 million people. I had them a little bit overbred. Anyway, it's most likely that they arrived at the mouth of the Congo River about 2,500 years ago. The Congo tribes people worked with iron, and they practiced fundamental agriculture. By the late 15th century, they were living in numerous kingdoms that were stretched on both sides of the Congo River. And although fishing and hunting are still practiced by some of the groups, many, if not most, of the Congo people today live, work, and trade in towns and in cities. Today's Congo people that live outside the city still cultivate cassava, bananas, maize, sweet potatoes, peanuts, and even taro. The crops that they grow those are the crops they grow for themselves. The crops that they grow for cash are coffee, cacao, palm oil, and urana. Now, urana is a plant. A lot of people consider it a weed. It's a tropical, subtropical kind of a plant. Other people don't treat it as a weed. They use the fiber for a lot of different purposes. The main purpose, surprisingly, is they use the fiber to make the sacks to carry coffee beans in. And extract from the leaves and roots have some antibacterial qualities, so you could always rub it on a cut or a wound. And the leaves and the flowers of the plant are often used for food during famines in Africa. The Ovimbundu are a Bantu ethnic group who live in central Angola. They'll be a little far away from where we're going to be, but overwhelmingly these people follow some Christianity, but they do mix that Christianity with their own practices, and many of them still retain the beliefs and practices of the traditional religions from ancient times in Africa. A lot of animism, voodoo, and so on. The first Ovimbundu drifted in from the north over the last 1,000 years, and they developed a pretty sophisticated agriculture. They also bred small animals in their farms, and they had chickens and goats and pigs. After the arrival of the Portuguese in the 16th century, the Ovimbundu people developed a caravan trade, and that was with people that were living further to the east. From them, they obtained wax, rubber, honey, and ivory. Trade agreements soon led to the development of metalwork and cornmeal production in the Ovimbundu community. Slavery and slave trade were an integral part of the Ovimbundu society. After the end of the slave trade, the caravans came to an end. What they did with the caravans is they would go east, they would capture slaves, they would get ivory, they would have the slaves carry the ivory back along the caravan route to bring it back to where they could market it. And then about 1910, just after the completion of the railway, the whole caravan thing came to an end. And pretty soon the Ovabundu took up producing just corn. They raised corn simply to sell to Portuguese traders. Large portions of native land were appropriated or expropriated by the Europeans for things like coffee, sisal, and for other plantations. And as a result, many of the Ubundu people began to work on those plantations, both in here and in the mines down in Namibia. In more recent times, these people were the core members of an organization called UNITA, and that was an anti-colonial movement that was they fought against the Portuguese in the Civil War that began about 1966. They were a major opposition to the government forces during the Angolan Civil War that lasted until 2002. Another prominent Angolan tribe is the Muila. Their necklaces are really significant as each period in their lives corresponds to a specific type and color and style of necklace. These women never take their necklaces off. They sleep with them on. Young girls wear very heavy red beads that are covered with a mix of soil and latex. Now, later on, as the girls mature, they start to wear yellow necklaces that are made of wicker that's covered with earth. And they keep all of that on until their wedding. Actually, they keep it on for the rest of their lives. And when they marry, they wear an additional set of stacked beads. They keep wearing more and more beads as each evolution of their life takes place. The Muila women are also famous for their very special hairstyles. In fact, we're trying to get the people up in the spa to adopt some of these techniques. They will use headrests to protect them when they sleep. They coat their hair with a red ochre and a paste that's made from both that red stone, red ochre. They also mix in with that some oil, some crushed tree bark, dried cow dung, and various herbs. I think the spa will really like that treatment. Then they will decorate their hair with beads and cowrie shells, and they'll even put some dried food in it. Now everybody knows where Lady Gaga got the idea to eat those or wear those slabs of meat. Anyway, the Muila rarely eat meat. They only kill their cattle for very special occasions, and that's very, very rare. Instead, these people eat porridge and corn, chicken, honey, and milk. They have a very simple diet. Muila are not allowed to mention people's names in public. God, our politicians would absolutely go nuts with that. The name Luanda came about the the third quarter of the 1500s, when a Portuguese explorer named Diogo Chao founded the city. He called it Sao Paulo de Assunção de Luanda. The settlement had about 700 Portuguese people. Half of those were soldiers. The Portuguese divided the Angolans that lived there into civilized and native. The way you became civilized was you learned about Portuguese lifestyle, and you had to maintain and keep a European lifestyle and be able to speak Portuguese. You had to have a basic education that was based on Christianity and so on. And they actually divided the city based on who had full rights of citizenship. Those were the civilized people, and those who were native who didn't have the full rights of citizenship. The Portuguese built several fortresses in Luanda, and of these, the Fortaleza de São Miguel is the best. It's preserved. It's really a pretty interesting place. It's the oldest structure in town, sits up fairly high on a hill. In 1664, the fort was altered to put it into the shape of a star, and that was to better guard the entrance to the bay. People that are familiar with Vauban and the forts in France realize that star shape, there's really no way you can, quote, sneak up on one of those forts because every side is protected by many different viewpoints. Until 1975, this fortress served as the headquarters for the commander-in-chief of the Portuguese armed forces that were in Angola, and today it has the Museum of the Armed Forces. Museum features things, oh, really exciting stuff, ladies, bimotor airplanes, combat vehicles. Actually, it is kind of an interesting place, and there's diverse arms and artifacts that were used all through Angola's wars. There are large, imposing statues of Portugal's first king, the first Europeans to reach Angola, Vasco da Gama, and other notables, and of course the Queen. Unfortunately, there are dozens of skyscrapers that are being built nearby, and a shopping mall is being built right in front of the fort. So you kind of have to get right up into the courtyard to see this place, because things pretty soon, the sight lines from off the fort aren't going to be very good. The Church of Our Lady of Nazareth in Luanda is a 17th century colonial building. In 1665, Portuguese forces defeated the Kingdom of the Congo, and they decapitated their king. His head was buried in the chapel that was here, and his crown and scepter were sent to Lisbon as trophies. The church itself is adorned with Portuguese tiles that depict several different miracles. Now, why did they build this church? Well, the governor at the time ordered this church to be constructed because he was saved from a shipwreck. He was on his way to Angola to save the save the Portuguese people from the Dutch. The Dutch had ruled Luanda for about 8 years, starting in 1640. And as I mentioned in past talks, the Dutch and the Portuguese seem to always be going at each other down here in West Africa. Only a few decades after the arrival of the Europeans in America, the demand for unpaid labor, we commonly refer to that as slaves, to work the plantations, made the slave trade a very profitable business. At the peak of the slave ships, the peak period of slave ships on the Atlantic Passage was between the 18th and the 19th centuries. Ships known as Guineamen would carry basically hundreds of slaves each, and they were all chained to plank beds. They were stacked in there like cordwood, and the ships were modified to provide as many separate decks to put as many people as they could in there to carry these people across the Atlantic. The most significant sea routes were from the western coast of Africa to South America, the Caribbean, and what today is the southeastern United States. Most slaves from Angola, particularly Angola, were sent to Brazil. Millions of Africans were carried out of Africa by ship over the total time. Early as 1750, between 5,000 and 10,000 slaves were sold in Luanda every year. From Angola alone, more than half of them went to Brazil. A third of the ones also went to the Caribbean, and 10 to 15% went to North America. Slaves were obtained by agents that were called pambieros. They roamed Africa's interior, and generally they followed pretty much established trade routes that the local people used. They bought slaves called pecas or pesas, which means pieces, from local chiefs inland, because the local chiefs would be at war with neighboring tribes, and they would capture people, and then they would sell them off as a way to make some money. The slaves were exchanged for commodities such as cloth and wine and, of course, firearms. The pambieros then returned to Luanda with chain gangs, literal chain gangs where these people were chained together containing several hundred captives. Most were pretty malnutrition, suffered pretty much in a state of starvation when they got at the end of that arduous trip. Basically at the coast, what would happen is they were fed. They were better fed. They were kept in horrific conditions, but they were much better fed, and that was simply to give them the strength to be carried across the ocean. They needed to be strong enough to survive a voyage on the very crowded, overcrowded, and unsanitary vessels. Those voyages across the Atlantic, no matter where they were going to go, would last anywhere from 5 weeks to 2 months, and many of them died en route. But, well, you don't want to send a bunch of heathens off to be a slave, so they took all of these people in to baptize them before they left. The Capella de Casa Grande near Luanda, that's the thing that's shown in this picture, is a 17th century structure. This is where the slaves were taken to be baptized by the Catholic priest before they were transported across the Atlantic. The chapel stands alone by itself out on a point, and it faces out to sea. The area around the chapel is pretty barren. There are no trees. It's pretty unfertile land, and it's symbolized, when you think about it, the isolation and the misery that was caused by the slave trade. The capella is really near the National Museum of Slavery, which is one of the old slave processing facilities. That museum was founded in 1977 in a building that was there during the slave era, and it depicts the history of slavery in Angola. Today, the museum displays hundreds of items that were utilized in the slave trade, and it's housed in a building that was once used, as I said, to process people to ship them overseas. These are very moving places when you go there. I'll kind of warn you right now. They're very emotional places because they just kind of tear your heart out when you see how badly people were treated. When we were up in Ghana, I had the chance to go to the two major slave castles, or palaces, if you will, up there, the fortresses where they processed these people. And when you see the conditions that the Portuguese and other slave traders kept these people in, you just can't believe that they treated human beings, other human beings, like that. It's just awful. And of course, that was not uncommon in almost all of West Africa. As we get a little further south, there's less evidence of the slave trade. Most of the slave trade came up on the north side of the Gulf of Guinea, and here as far south as Luanda. In 1807, the slave trade was finally outlawed by the United States and the United Kingdom. This is a British warship that's capturing a slave ship that was basically trying to outrun them. Within a decade, most of Europe, Spain, Portugal, France, and the Netherlands, also agreed to ban the slave trade and to abolish it in their own colonies. And that meant that the slave ships leaving Africa were now all essentially pirate vessels. Well, what do pirates do? They don't want to be captured by military ships, so they modified their vessels. They still wanted to be able to carry slaves, but they modified their vessels so that they could go faster, and then that meant that they might be able to outrun the military vessels. Well, the military put enough vessels out here so that they could stop most of it. They didn't stop quite all of it, but they did stop most of it. This is a picture of the new version of it, but while it was under Portuguese rule, Luanda experienced what I would call as a major economic revolution. They opened the gates to the aqueduct, the first aqueduct, and that supplied water to the city for the first time. Before that, water in the city had to be carried in from well out into the countryside. It was a very scarce resource. European settlers finally began to establish themselves in Angola. By 1850, Luanda was one of the greatest and most developed cities in the Portuguese Empire, and they called it the Paris of Africa. I don't know why they didn't call it the Lisbon of Africa, but they called it the Paris of Africa. From 1911 until 1914, Germany and Britain began to secretly hold negotiations to break up Portuguese Angola. They wanted the territory. They wanted to divide the spoils among themselves. You know, why let little Portugal have all that stuff? We can take it. The Germans hoped also that they would be able to transport food and arms through the country to their forces that were working down in Namibia and even down into South Africa. The Portuguese government got word of all of these negotiations, and they sent military reinforcements to Angola. When they got there, they arrested and incarcerated German nationals as often as they could find them. Pretty soon, the German forces in Southwest Africa surrendered, and that ended the whole campaign. Portuguese forces, though, continued to fight because there were some people still in the country who were resisting colonial occupation. Otherwise, Portugal's presence in Angola was pretty minimal for about 500 years. I mean, they just had this colony way down south where they got gold and diamonds and, you know, that kind of stuff. But there wasn't really any interest in really going down there and doing much, so they didn't pay much attention to the colonies. Calls for Angolan independence inspired just a little response in Portugal. Portugal said, oh, those people want to be free. Well, we'll worry about that later. So they really didn't get much attention. But more active political and nationalist organizations in Angola began to appear in the 1950s, and all of these organizations were demanding independence from Portugal. The Angolan War of Independence began as an uprising against the forced cultivation of cotton. I mean, they still had people that were indentured servants, probably even some slaves. And it became a struggle for control of Portuguese overseas province that they knew as Angola. The war essentially ended, when there was a coup d'etat up in Portugal. The Carnation Revolution ended the war because all of a sudden the new ruling party in Portugal decided they wanted to get rid of all of these colonies. They wanted to set them free. And basically the new government started to grant independence without delay. And Angola was one of the first African nations to receive independence from that European power. After the war, armed conflict broke out within Angola between, these are a whole bunch of names, and you don't have to write these down because they won't be on the final. There was the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola. That was UNITA. There was the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. That was MPALA. There was the National Liberation Front of Angola, the FINLA. And then there was all of these groups that were going against each other. Well, UNITA resumed guerrilla wars against MIPLA. And the United Nations, the United States, Brazil, and South Africa funded UNITA, and they provided munitions, intelligence reports, and mercenaries. Well, MIPLA wasn't to be left out because they got aid from the USSR and Cuba. Cuba sent troops and forces over here. In fact, a lot of people in Angola consider this to have been Cuba's Vietnam. The Marxist-oriented MPLA wrested control of most of Angola. Heavy fighting continued here until about 1991, when finally an accord was reached that mandated a new national government and led to Angola's first multi-party elections. Jose dos Santos was the MPLA's leader, and he won 49% of the popular vote during the election. Dos Santos, though, he's been accused of leading one of the most corrupt regimes in all of Africa because he ignores the social needs of the people, and he really just kind of thinks the economy is his own. Basically, he's been amassing wealth for his family and silencing his opposition. The wealthiest woman in Africa is his daughter, Isabel dos Santos. There was a detailed investigation that was conducted by an American major business magazine. We won't tell you who it is, but it's on the screen. And that suggested that she acquired her wealth of more than $3 billion from her father. In 2012, she celebrated her 10th wedding anniversary. To do that, she flew in dozens of friends and relatives from as far away as Germany or even Brazil. And they were joined by hundreds of local guests for 3 days of lavish treatment that included things like a private bash that was up at the fortress of São Miguel. Now let's see where some of the other money went. The United States government, why we did it, I don't know, but anyway, they investigated corruption and money laundering here. Actually, I think they did it because it was all tied to some of the financial activity that was going on in the banks back in the States. Anyway, they found that the governor of the National Bank of Angola initiated a series of suspicious $50 million U.S. transactions in United States banks. And during his tenure as the central bank governor, the government could not account for approximately $2.4 billion. It was reported by the Human Rights Watch, and finally the Angolan government admitted this. Some $32 billion of oil revenue is missing and cannot be accounted for. That represents about 1/4 of Angola's girls tend to perform the more labor-intensive work than the men and boys do. The men and boys are out taking care of the herds, and the women and the girls will do things like carry water from distant places into the village. Himba women prepare an incense, and the smoke is then used as an antimicrobial body cleansing agent and a deodorant. The fragrance is made by burning these aromatic herbs and resins. Both the fire and the livestock are pretty closely tied to the veneration of the dead. The sacred fire represents the ancestral protection, and the sacred livestock allows, quote, proper relations between the humans and their ancestors, unquote. The women of this semi-nomadic tribe get their skin color from a mixture of oil and ochre. Achazai's paste is a mixture of butterfat and ochre pigment that's used to cleanse the skin over long periods of time, mostly because they don't have water. So they take this mixture and they rub it on their skin. They do this routinely, probably every day. It protects them from the extremely hot, dry climate, and it also protects them from insect bites. The Himba women wear these thick braids and animal hide skirts and headdresses and ornaments. Now in this picture, the two women on the left side with the dark, almost gray look to their hair are unmarried. And you can tell that they're unmarried because of the style where their hair comes down in like pigtails hanging down in the front, somewhat like a veil. Sometimes the one braid, if it's a boy, you'll see one braid, it'll go down in the back for a young boy. Two braids for girls extend forward to make that veil, and they'll have those braids until they're married. Usually a gathering of these Himba women in Swakopmund, which is the little town or city that's very close to Walvis Bay, and a lot of people I think are going to go to Swakopmund. They're usually found right behind the local museum, and they don't mind having their pictures taken. If you buy a trinket, it could be just a little bracelet, a little statue, whatever. If you are good enough to just buy something from them, you can take all the pictures you want. Use all your digits up just taking pictures of these beautiful women, and they're perfectly happy to let you do that. But they would like you to buy something. They don't just want you to give them money to take their picture. It's interesting to watch these women and the interface between themselves, the interplay between them and their children. Because you got these little children, usually they're little toddlers and smaller, and they're all running around where these women are, and the way they interact with their mothers is really pretty amazing. It's really kind of a nice thing to see how caring they are. Now, you don't see any men. The men are about 20 yards away in traditional Western dress. And they're there, why? To kind of keep an eye, not because they're afraid the women are going to do something wrong, but to protect the women. But anyway, Swakopmund is a really great place to visit, and as I said, it's not very far from Walvis Bay. The first Europeans to disembark and explore the Namibian region were the Portuguese navigators back in the late 15th century. But they didn't settle here. I mean, when you see this thing from the coastline, you're not going to want to settle here either. Namibia wasn't extensively explored by Europeans until the 19th century, not that long ago, and that's when the German and Swedish traders came here and settled. The town of Luderitz began its life as a little trading post when the land was purchased by a German tobacco merchant named Alfred Luderitz. When he did not return from an expedition to the village, they decided they'd name the settlement after him. Most of the surrounding area around the town was purchased just a few years later. What is now Namibia became a German colony in 1884 under Otto von Bismarck. He wanted to basically stop or stall the British advancements in Africa. But the British governor in Cape Town had determined that the only natural deep water port was Walvis Bay, and that was the only thing that was worth occupying. So just Walvis Bay was annexed to the Cape Province by the British in South Africa. Swakopmund was founded just a little ways away in 1892 by the Germans, and a sizable part of the population there today still has some German-speaking capability. City is situated on the edge of the Namib Desert. It's the fourth largest population center in the country. Nearby Mondesa Township was established to provide housing for the Herero people that work in Swakopmund. During the colonial era, blacks were not allowed to live in the center of Swakopmund. In 1903, some of the tribes rose in revolt and about 60 German settlers were killed. German general then issued orders to kill every male Herero and drive the women and children into the desert. Some 65,000 of the Herero people were murdered. That was 80% of their population at the time. When the general's order was finally lifted, prisoners were herded into concentration camps and they were used as slave labor. Many of the Herero people died from overwork and malnutrition. And when the survivors were released from detention, they were then deported or they were forced into labor, racial segregation, and discrimination areas. It took until about 1908 to reestablish the German authority over the territory. By that time, some 100,000 Africans had been killed. Memory of that genocide is deeply ingrained in Namibia. The people here, it's one of those things that's almost visceral. The German government formally apologized for this finally to the Namibians in 2004. At the same time, trade in Lüderitz began to surge. Railway worker found a diamond just laying in the sand. Oh, wow, you found a diamond. That's going to spread the news pretty quickly. The adjacent diamond mining settlement of Kolmanskap was built. In its heyday, hundreds of families lived in the German-influenced town. This is a little different. I'm going to take a little aside here. A little different than other mining communities because they don't have a big pit where they went down and they dug the mine. Their workers literally crawled on hands and knees through the sand, picking up the diamonds because they were just laying in the sand. You go there today and there are signs that say, if you find a diamond, do not pick it up. It's against the law. It's a protected site. Anyway, this little facility had a hospital, a ballroom, a casino, a bowling alley, and the first X-ray station in the Southern Hemisphere. Today, Kolmanskap's exteriors have pretty much been battered by the wind, and very little remains of the town's former glory. When you go there, you can see in your mind, you can imagine how wonderful this town must have been at one time. But today it fights a constant struggle against being buried under the shifting sand dunes of the Namib Desert. There's something that's pretty riveting about the desolation of this town as the whole thing is slowly being absorbed back into the sand. It's an interesting place. I think people that go there will really enjoy it. South Africa occupied Lüderitz in 1915 after defeating the German forces in World War I, and they administered Lüderitz from then onward as a League of Nations mandated territory. Many Germans were deported. That contributed to the colony's shrinking population numbers. During the occupation of Namibia by South Africa, white commercial farmers represented only 0.2% of the total population of the country, but they owned 74% of the arable land. In 1946, South Africa refused to surrender Namibia. The Herero Chiefs Council, which was a council of all of the native chiefs within the country, submitted a number of petitions to the United Nations calling for the UN to grant Namibia independence. In 1966, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia began a long guerrilla campaign in the struggle for independence. And it wasn't until 1988 that South Africa agreed to end its occupation of Namibia. Namibia's independence was arranged under a diplomatic agreement between South Africa, Angola, and Cuba, along with the USSR and the USA as observers. As a result, Cuba agreed to remove or pull back all of its troops that were stationed in Angola. Namibia's first one-person, one-vote elections for the Constitutional Assembly took place a year later in 1989. The official election slogan at the time was "Fair and Free Elections." Namibia's first president was Sam Nujoma. He was sworn in right after the election. He was carefully watched over and kind of guided, if you will, by another man from just a little further to the south who was quite famous, the name of Nelson Mandela, who had been released from prison just a month before Nujoma took office. There were also representatives from some 147 countries, including 20 heads of state that watched the whole process of the election. Walvis Bay was finally ceded to Namibia at the end of the apartheid in South Africa in 1994. Namibia has started to do some expropriating of land from white farmers, and they want to resettle those landless black Namibians back into the farms that they had in antiquity. Agreement has been reached on the privatization of several more enterprises, and those will start to turn over in the years ahead. The governments of Germany and Britain are financing Namibia's land reform process quite successfully, I might add. And there are hopes that it will stimulate much needed foreign investment across the country. There are still some hopes that all of this is going to be pretty progressive. Since 1991, English is the only official language in Namibia, although some 3% of the population still, 3% of the people speak English at home. The rest of the time they speak Bantu or some of the original African languages. Now, I think you're going to like Namibia. It's a really interesting country. It's very refreshing after what we have experienced in some of the other places in West Africa. It is not without poverty. There are some poor people, and outside of Swakopmund, there are some villages that are extremely poor. But one of the things you will notice as you go around Namibia, it's a relatively clean country. You don't see the debris and the litter here that you did in some of the other places in West Africa. The people are quite friendly. They do accept American money. They also accept euro. They prefer small bills. They don't like large bills except late in the afternoon when they will trade their small bills back to you for some large bills. It's kind of an interesting exchange rate thing, but I think you'll really like it here. From Walvis Bay to Swakopmund and the north part, our first port, very, very interesting, very, I'll say pretty towns. They're very clean, very nice looking places. Now I'm going to go down the hall to baristas. This thing will repeat on Channel 9. If you want to talk to me about Namibia or what we're going to do there, please come down and join me. And I'd like to thank you. Enjoy the day.